Chapter 3. The Lake. 1. The church clock had just struck the half-hour, as William and Elsie arrived at Uncle Walter's antique shop as arranged. William had borrowed Aunt Edna's bicycle, which she hardly used now she had the new van. He hadn't ridden for a long time, and was a bit unsure of himself at first. Bridget and Chris were already outside the shop waiting for them, and all four set off in the direction of the church and the Dronfall road. First up was St. Clementine Girls' School, which both Elsie and Bridget attended. The school was situated next to Avenfore Church and was a rather stately building with huge gardens and a 6-foot-high iron gate. William listened with fascination as Chris explained that both St. Elm's and St. Clementine's had been built by Fergus Mulween of Ravenwood Castle, the current owner's grandfather, to ensure that the boys and girls in the area would not have to leave home to study. Fergus had also funded a great part of the building of the new church in Avenfore in 1888, after the old one at Hollypoint had burnt down. All in all, William thought St. Clementine's looked like a good place to go to school, and judging from the way Elsie and Bridget talked about it, they were very happy there. Not far past the girls' school, William saw a track that seemed to be little used. "Where does that lead to?" he asked, pointing to it. "It goes through Blackwood Forest and then off in several directions," Elsie explained as they cycled on. "But it's all too easy to get lost, and hardly anyone uses it." St. Elm's Boys' School lay a few hundred yards further out on the opposite side of the road overlooking the River Inny, and was the last building on this side of the village. Chris got off his bike and announced, "William, your new school." The entrance to the building was not quite as regal as that of St. Clementine's. A somewhat deteriorated wrought-iron arch bearing the school's name spanned the two solid stone pillars on either side of the iron gate. The school building lay at the other end of a large, well-tended garden, which was divided by a long driveway, bordered by beeches, chestnuts and centuries-old oaks that led up to the main door. "It's magnificent," William cried, "and far bigger than I'd imagined. Can we go in and look at it close up?" Chris hesitated. "We're not really supposed to," he said. "Mr. Normantle, the caretaker, will read the riot act if he finds us." Chris checked his wristwatch. "But I think I saw him heading into Avenfore for his lunch earlier, so we should be able to get in without being seen. But we'll have to be quick about it." Bridget was looking rather uneasy. "Do we really have to go in?" she asked. "Oh, come on, Bridget, don't be a scaredy cat, please come in with me," Elsie pleaded, hopping from one foot to the next with curiosity. Bridget sighed. "Oh, all right," she said, and Elsie threw her a bright smile. The four ventured into the garden almost as far as the main doors, and crouched behind a fountain adorned with marble cherubim in the front courtyard of the school. The main doorway boasted an elegant, gently arched portico. The high chimney stacks rising from the roof also caught the eye. The classrooms and refectories were on the ground floor, and the first and second floors housed the boarders. "We'd better leave," said Bridget, looking worried. "I feel I'm being watched and I don't like it." "There," she said, gesturing towards one of the second-floor windows. "Somebody's looking at us out of that window." They all looked up to where Bridget had pointed, but the curtains were swiftly drawn and they couldn't see who it was. "Oh no, that must be Mr. Normantle," Chris said. "Let's hope he didn't recognize us." "No, I don't think so," his sister protested. "I think it was a woman." "Don't be silly, Bridge," Chris replied. "Now let's get out of here." He took off towards the gate, with the rest following him at a fast pace. As they got back on their bicycles, Elsie gave a sigh of relief. "Well, let's go to the lake, shall we?" "But that will take ages, Else," Bridget grumbled. "We'll have to go back into the village and all around. It's just so far." "Not really," her brother said. "I know a secret path into the forest near here which goes near Ravenwood Castle, and then on to the lake." Elsie smiled at Chris. "Let's do that so," she said, ignoring the sulky look on Bridget's face as they set off along the path to the lake which ran alongside the boys' school in the direction of the river. 2. After a while Chris stopped. From here on we'll have to walk." Leaving the bikes against a tree, the four of them set off along another narrow pathway. Even Elsie and Bridget were intrigued. They didn't know of the existence of this path and they'd never been in this part of the forest before. Minutes later, Chris stopped again. 20 yards or so to the right, they could make out an area of particularly thick overgrowth that made a natural barrier. Chris headed towards it and gestured to them to follow. They followed the natural barrier for a while, Bridget hanging on tightly to Elsie's arm. In a clearing where there was more ivy than bushes, Chris paused and looked around him, studying the undergrowth. "I'm certain it's this way," he said, tugging up some of the ivy. "Ah, here it is." Hidden among the plants was an iron gate which, by the look of it, had not been used for ages. Chris pulled away the last ivy creepers and tried to open it. He could hardly budge it an inch, so he called to William to help. Together, they managed to pull it open. "This is the secret entrance to Ravenwood," Chris explained. "Hardly anyone knows of its existence, not even Mr. Mulween. I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't mention it to anyone else." "And how did you come to know about it, Chris?" asked Elsie. "Some years back, when I used to go fishing with Dad, we once saw Dronfall the gardener coming out of here." "It's obviously not used very much," said Bridget, who was still holding on to Elsie. Before going through, Chris urged them not to make noise. On the other side of the gate, they made their way through the trees to the top of a mound from where the castle could be seen below them. Ravenwood Castle was in a magnificent setting. It faced south and was only 100 yards from Lake Dronfall. A path through the garden led down to a mooring point, a reminder of its aristocratic past. William was fascinated by it all, even though it was nothing like he'd imagined. "The garden seems rather abandoned, don't you think?" he murmured at last. "I guess it's too much work for just one gardener." "Even so, I like it the way it is," replied Chris. Elsie whispered, "Frankly, I can't see how anyone would want to stay there." "Not much choice," said Bridget. "It's not as if there are many other places to board in the village." William was puzzled. "Stay there? I thought Mr. Mulween lived there alone," he asked. "Not entirely," Chris explained. "Byron Mulween gets some money in rent from St. Elm's and St. Clem's, but that wouldn't be enough to pay for the upkeep of the castle, so Ravenwood is a guesthouse these days. It might not look like it, but the inside is very tasteful and welcoming." Elsie threw Chris a look which clearly said she didn't believe anything to do with Byron Mulween could look tasteful or welcoming. "I'd love to see inside the castle," William said eagerly. "I don't think they'd let you in," said Bridget, sounding rather relieved that they wouldn't. William looked so disappointed that Elsie took pity on him. "Actually, Will, I just remembered," said Elsie. "Mr. Mulween called on Dad the other day to ask him to go and service a grandfather clock he has. I think Dad's due to go over there next week." "That's great, Elsie, thanks. I'll ask Uncle Walter if I can go too. It would be a wonderful opportunity to get to know the castle better." Delighted with the idea, he added, "Shall we go to the lake now?" "Follow me," Chris cried, and the three others followed him down the narrow pathway which ran through the forest that led to the lake. Even though it was close to Avenfore, Lake Dronfall, which lay at the foot of Dronfall Mountain, was surrounded by an ancient forest that made it almost inaccessible. The few existing paths were rough and hardly any of the villagers went there, except for those like Chris's father who were keen fishermen. They reached a clearing near the lake, and William ran to the shore. He gazed at the lake for a few long moments, never imagining it could be so vast. Its waters were teeming with birds. There were herons stalking the still shallows at the edge of the lake seeking out their prey, and graceful swans sailing along with their cygnets in tow. Elsie and Bridget perched themselves on some large rocks at the edge of the forest and chatted, while Chris joined William at the shore. "Quite something, isn't it?" he said. William was so absorbed and lost for words that he simply nodded. Chris pointed at a thick clump of forest and rock which rose up out of the lake, away out from the shoreline to their left. That's one of the largest islands on the lake. It's called the Isle of Leshurn. It has curious feature, although it's an island you can actually walk to it. William didn't quite follow this, but he didn't question Chris further. He felt like an explorer coming across uncharted land. It's incredible how this place hasn't changed for hundreds of years. I guess you're right, Chris replied, but when you live here you don't see it like that. It just seems normal. Pointing along the lake edge to their left, he said, "You see that area overgrown with reeds and lilies? That's the source of the River Inny. As you can see, all those rushes make it impossible to get here by boat from the village. So no boats at all can get into the lake," William said. "The only boats on the lake are those at the Ravenwood pier, and the mooring belonging to Mr. Greewolf, the Latin teacher at St. Elm's." "Mr. Greewolf," mused William. That name rang a bell. "Do you know Mr. Greewolf?" asked Chris. William shook his head. Then he remembered the letter his father had slipped him at the station, and which was still in the pocket of the jacket he had been wearing the day before. He'd completely forgotten about it, but now some questions were starting to nag at him. Why had his dad asked him to tell nobody about it? What could it mean? William was starting to get interested in Mr. Greewolf. "You say he teaches Latin at St. Elm's?" "That's right," Chris explained. "He's also an expert in botany and he's passionate about old books." "So where does he live then?" William asked, trying not to sound too interested. Chris pointed further up the shoreline to their left. "Look over there in those trees. Can you see a thatched roof?" William had to look very closely to make out what Chris was trying to show him. A little distance along the shore and among the trees, he could just discern a brownish patch of something poking out from among the trees. "That's the roof of his house. Abelard Greewolf is a kind chap. I'm sure he'd lend us his boat if we asked." By now Elsie and Bridget had joined them. "It's probably time we were heading back," Elsie said. "You're probably right. Come on, Will, let's go." They turned to leave, but at that moment, something caught William's eye over towards the Ravenwood end of the lake. "Look," he said. "Over there." "What?" Elsie asked. "What is it?" "There, on the lake. There seems to be a boat with 2 people in it." "It's a boat coming to the Ravenwood mooring point," said Chris. "Oh, I don't like this," Bridget wailed. "What if they see us?" "Bridget's right," William said, and crouched down behind one of the large rocks which littered the shoreline. The others did the same, and they all watched in silence as the boat finally reached the mooring point, and one of its occupants jumped out to tie it up. The other followed, and between them they hoisted a heavy sack out of the boat, put it into a wheelbarrow, and set off towards the castle. The 4 friends looked at each other in amazement when they saw that the sack was covered in red stains that looked horribly like blood. Beside William, Bridget gulped in terror. The 2 figures took the sack to the servants' entrance, which led to the cellars of the castle. "I don't know about you lot, but I'm getting out of here," squeaked Bridget, and she set off crawling down the mound. "Wait, I'm coming with you," Elsie hissed. As she got up, she accidentally stood on a dry branch, which broke with a loud snap. Elsie threw herself down again behind the nearest rock and held her breath, not daring to move a muscle. The sound alarmed the ravens in the trees behind them, and they flew off cawing. All 4 froze, worried that the sound had given them away. The 2 figures at the castle stopped in their tracks, alarmed by the ravens, and looked towards the shoreline where William and the others were hiding. Bridget, who was nearest the forest and out of sight, fled in fright. The other 3 kept still, low behind the rocks on the shoreline. They could see a strange light glinting from the left side of the face of one of the individuals as he looked in their direction. They couldn't be sure if they'd been spotted, but when the 2 men went back to their task, the 3 of them slipped away from their hiding places and sprinted off after Bridget. Hastily pushing the gate closed, they tore back to where they'd left their bicycles. Fighting to get her breath back, Bridget started to speak. Do you think what we saw was normal? Still panting, she went on, I've had more than enough for today. I'd like to get back to the village, if you don't mind. They all agreed that after all that had happened, it was the most sensible thing to do. Elsie shook out her dress before getting on her bicycle and then said, It was Byron Mulween and his caretaker. I know because Ernest got a glass eye. I always thought Mr. Mulween was a shady fellow, she continued, but I never thought him capable of, well, that. William noticed that Elsie and Bridget were both staring at Chris, as though waiting for some explanation. Don't stare at me like that, Chris said. Right now I can't account for what we saw, but I'm convinced it can't be anything like what you two are thinking. Well, until you come up with a reasonable explanation, I'll continue to believe that that sack had a body in it, said Elsie, visibly angry. Chris threw up his hands. Are you crazy, Elsie? You can't believe that. William could find no explanation himself for what he'd just seen. Then a thought occurred to him. It might not have been a human body they were carrying, he suggested. Maybe they'd been hunting. No. It's not the seas. Chris began, then suddenly seemed to change his mind. Actually, you might be right, William. It must be some game they were carrying. William had the feeling Chris was deliberately holding something back, but it was clear Elsie and Bridget were happy with that explanation, although Bridget still wanted to return to the village as quickly as possible. Do you think they saw us? Asked Elsie. I hope not, said Chris with a worried look. He was obviously feeling guilty about taking them there. You must all promise that you'll never say a word about the secret entrance. Don't worry, Chris, William reassured him. We won't say anything to anybody. Thanks, William, Chris replied. Well, at least I now know why it's called Ravenwood, declared Elsie, trying to lighten the mood. I don't know what frightened me more, what I saw or all those ghastly ravens. It's all rather funny, said William. This morning when I got up early and walked around the village, I thought Avenfore was the most peaceful place on earth. To his embarrassment, Bridget took his hands in hers and gave them a squeeze. I'm so sorry, William, she said softly. You've been really unlucky that this has happened on your first day here. Nothing out of the normal ever happens in Avenfore. From now on we're going to have a great time. I promise.